Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and obviously, as you might imagine, we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking back to the oral arguments yesterday on the issue of abortion. I might also mention that my commentary today is something I mentioned yesterday, but you may not have had a chance to hear it, and that is that if you compare the law out of Mississippi being considered right now, even if it were enacted, and there's a big question about that, which we'll get into in just a minute, it would not make America different. It would actually make America similar to basically most of the countries in Europe. And that, matter of fact, came up yesterday because they pointed out that really there are only a few countries that have such radical abortion laws, and there are places like Russia and China. And some people say, do we really want to be in that company? So we will get to that. And so I might just mention my Viewpoints commentary today will also be something you might want to get access to. We have a couple of articles I've posted, how the justices showed that they were skeptical of Roe versus Wade. Also, the question about the threat from Democrats that if they don't get their decision, they're going to use this to justify packing the court. I got a feeling that Lathan Watts, when he joins us tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition, will have some things to say about that. And then we'll continue on with a couple of other arguments that were made or have been made in the past. Let me just mention that if you don't have a copy of my little booklet on abortion, we've made it available in the past, but again, it may be something you would like to have as a resource simply because you find yourself engaged in all sorts of conversation and debate. I didn't really mention it yesterday, but we now also have an action item, and I'm going to focus more time and attention on it today. The Build Back Better Act is now in front of the United States Senate. Just as we encouraged you to express your opinion in the House of Representatives to your one representative, some of your representatives may have agreed with you, some of them may disagree with you. We now have it in front of the United States Senate, and unless they can get at least 50 votes, even under reconciliation, it will not go forward, and there are very good reasons to believe that it should not. And we have given you quite a list. But let me just as a preview mention that tomorrow we're going to have also, in addition to Lathan Watts, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and he has written some very good pieces that have come out over the last couple of weeks on some other things in the bill that we didn't even include as other concerns. So we will certainly spend some time with him talking about that tomorrow. If that's not enough, bottom of the hour, we're going to be spend a little bit of time talking with our good friend Dr. Paul Gould. He's been on before as we've talked about, well, all sorts of things from philosophy to even creation. He's written on cultural apologetics. He's, of course, written on the idea of astronomy and creation, really demonstrating the existence of God. He is actually one of the editors of what's called the Worldview Bulletin. We've had him and others on the program before, about a year ago, to talk about it, and I thought so highly of it that I subscribed to it. I was just looking over my bills the other day, and we resubscribed in August. So again, as I oftentimes say, I'm not encouraging you to do something I don't do. I think this Worldview Bulletin is really good, and this is a piece about work and calling. So I just spent a little bit of time talking with him about that. Also, if you're looking for a great present for somebody who wants to think biblically about these issues, that's something you might want to consider. Next hour, we'll talk a little bit with a man by the name of Michael Andrews, who has his doctorate in ministry, and it's called The Influential Christian, and it is kind of a different way of talking about about this kind of focus on leadership, but with empathy. And I think you really appreciate that. If that's not enough, by the time that interview's over, we'll still have some time in the second hour. I do want to talk a little bit about a couple of issues. One, we have a new CEO of Twitter. What does that mean? And so I thought it might be good to at least put a piece up by Ann Coulter. She's, of course, using a little bit of sarcasm. We'll try to explain that as we go along. We also have the president, Joe Biden, arguing that the reason we have problems with filling the grocery shelves is not unusual. Some of you might remember back in the 1980s and 90s when parents couldn't find Cabbage Patch Kids or Beanie Babies. I'm not making this up. I mean, that's really what he was saying, which you talk about just that sounded clueless, but we can get into that in a little more detail. So we'll talk about that as well. And if we have time, also, the issue of Salvation Army, we still get people saying, what about this? Have they apologized? Or what about this? Has Salvation Army gone woke? So we'll try to get into that. And if we don't have time for that today, we certainly, I'm sure, will get into it tomorrow. First article on the website is one which comes from the editors that actually have written about this in National Review. And they point out that yesterday, as we heard a little bit from David French, the various justices seem somewhat skeptical about Roe versus Wade. No, of course not Breyer and Sotomayor and some of the others, Kagan, but most of the others did. And as they point out in this piece, the Supreme Court heard these arguments on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which of course will determine whether or not that bill, which would actually ban abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, would actually be implemented and thus could be used to overturn Roe versus Wade. And if that is the case, this would, as they say, end 48 years of judicial usurpation and restore the primacy of the Constitution. And whether you're for abortion or against, I've found that, and I will give you a list later, of individuals who certainly would be considered pro-abortion, pro-choice, who nevertheless begrudgingly admit that the case that was made back in 1973 is not defensible from a constitutional point of view. And as they point out, nobody seriously, during the oral arguments, seriously tried to even defend Roe versus Wade as the correct reading of the Constitution, which tells you a lot right there. Instead, what they did was circle the wagons and talk about the institutional importance of adhering to past precedents. Of course, it was not too long before you had some of the others arguing. Sometimes we've had some really bad precedents that needed to be overturned. Red Scott on slavery, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. We can go down a very long list of ones that did indeed overturn precedent. So that was the case. And later on in this piece, it points out that the real kind of swing vote might be Justice Kavanaugh. And nevertheless, even though he's seen as the swing vote, he also stressed how sometimes the court has jettisoned prior precedents and returned again to the theme that the issue should be that abortion should be neutral, small d democratic middle ground. Justice Roberts, another kind of obvious because he's the Chief Justice, John Roberts, also compared Roe versus Wade to the abortion regimes of China and North Korea, and noted that we should be a little bit concerned about finding ourselves in that company. And then one other possible swing vote, although I think it's less likely, would be Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who has given birth to 5 children and adopted 2 more, pushed up against the notion that women are forced to be parents, given the option to give up a child for adoption. And so they didn't seem quite as impressed with some of the arguments being made to overturn the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization bill. Instead seemed quite willing to, if anything, overturn Roe versus Wade. We won't know till June, but when we come back, I'll talk about a little bit of the fallout from that, and then we'll move on to our conversation, which will be taking place with Paul Gould on work and calling. Lots to cover today, but if you'd like to join us, I'll open up the phones too, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Abortion is in the news because of the Mississippi law being considered by the Supreme Court. It limits elective abortion to 15 weeks. Although critics portray it as extreme, it really isn't much different from what we are seeing in current laws in Europe. Angelina Guyon explains that America is the outlier. She does a comparative analysis between the Mississippi law and the European abortion laws, which also limit abortion to less than 15 weeks gestation. Here's some of the numbers. Of the 50 European countries analyzed in the report, 8 do not allow elective abortion at all. They either prohibit abortion altogether or else allow abortion for only specific reasons, such as socioeconomic grounds, fetal abnormalities, rape, or incest. Of the 42 remaining European countries, 39 of them limit abortion to 15 weeks gestation or earlier. A majority of those 39 countries set gestational limits for elective abortion at or before 12 weeks gestation. Americans often want to follow the pattern in the UK, but they would be surprised to learn that the country restricts abortion more than the U.S. Great Britain still requires a woman to provide some justification to legally obtain an abortion. She predicts there would be a national uproar if elective abortion was limited merely to the first trimester, yet the Mississippi law is less restrictive than the abortion policies in 47 of the European countries. The law is mainstream and perhaps even permissive based upon European standards. Currently, a woman can obtain an abortion in the U.S. without having to provide a reason, need, or justification. The Supreme Court has allowed some states to limit abortion in the third trimester and for a small number of other reasons, but when compared to Europe, America is the outlier. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court decision coming down and, of course, the oral arguments yesterday. And I do want to talk about the reaction from some Democrats that are saying, well, if we don't get what we want from the Supreme Court, we'll use this to justify packing the court, which is really something that is going to affect the institution even more than any kind of decision about that. And just a minute ago, I certainly quoted from a piece coming from our friends at National Review, and you can find others at the Wall Street Journal and a variety of other places that say that as well. And even if you read between the lines in some of the articles in New York Times, Washington Post, there are many people who think it's at least possible that there would be a change in the Roe versus Wade decision. On the other side, there is a real concern, and this one I've not posted, but you can certainly find it easily, and that's by Andrew McCarthy. He's been on the program with us before. He's got a legal background. Matter of fact, probably best known as the individual that brought the first lawsuit and prosecution of the first attack on the World Trade Center, which most people have forgotten about. But nevertheless, he is concerned about what he calls the big fake. Now, over the last couple of months, we've heard everybody talking about the big lie. Well, what's the big fake? The big fake, he says, might actually affect such people as the ones I just mentioned. Chief Justice John Roberts, maybe Neil Gorsuch, maybe Brett Kavanaugh, maybe Amy Coney Barrett, maybe all of them. And the big fake, he says, is the prediction, or really even, he says, the assurance that following the Constitution will have immediate apocalyptic consequences. And we, of course, heard this before, that we are going to lose the credibility of the court. Now, I might just mention that we in the past have pointed out that there are some very good pieces that have come out saying this might actually return the court back to some kind of legitimacy. But another part of the big fake is also the assertion that if the Supreme Court, quote, bans abortion, the practice will go back to, well, back alley quacks and other individuals. And, of course, that is not true if for no other reason than even if the Supreme Court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, what would it do? It would send those back to the various states. And so that is certainly the case. And he says there are all sorts of others. He says, but look how the big fake worked before when it was said that if indeed the Supreme Court did not save Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that's enough to actually cow and push and manipulate Chief Justice Roberts to changing his mind, because the big fake then was that tens of millions of people were going to lose their medical care, which of course is not true. But each one of these doomsday predictions, according to Andrew McCarthy, is not plausible, but it's still possible that it weighs heavily on the minds of those who would be in other circumstances more inclined to overturn Roe versus Wade, and especially since the only argument which was being made is stare decisis, which is Latin term for basically keeping the precedent as it is. Lathan Watts has a great turn of phrase that he uses, so I'll leave it to him tomorrow to explain his definition for stare decisis, but nevertheless, the Supreme Court really would not be banning abortion. What it would simply be doing is saying, really, the Constitution has nothing to say about this particular procedure. We can't mandate it. We can't prohibit it. The states are left to regulate that. And so that's the big state, the big fake. We all have said, and this article goes on to even remind us that if indeed this happened, the blue states probably would enact fairly permissive abortion laws. The red states might be more tightly regulating those. And he says all of that might happen, but he's skeptical. And, some of us have been down that before. You can think of Lucy and Charlie Brown and the football, and that illustration may be the case certainly back in 1992 with Planned Parenthood versus Casey, or even the more recent one here. So we'll see where it goes. But just before we take a break, I did want to spend a little bit of time on our second article, and that is yesterday, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is a Democrat from New Hampshire, as this particular piece, which, by the way, let me just say, it's written by Jonathan Turley. Now, again, you've maybe heard me mention that Jonathan Turley would not agree with most of the things we say around this table. He is a professor at George Washington University. He has voted for Hillary Clinton. He has voted for Joe Biden. He agrees with liberal ideas. He has almost always voted for Democrats. Maybe he's voted for Republicans sometime along the way, but, you talk about somebody who's anti-Trump. Okay. But at the same time, I have got to appreciate his intellectual integrity, because when he sees some of these things happening, he sounds like he really actually should be in the Republican Party, one of the commentators for Fox News, although sometimes he's on that program. And here he's pointing out the fact that Jeanne Shaheen basically says you have to reaffirm Roe versus Wade or else. And he says the else is we're going to pack the court. And then he goes through, if you would like to read this in its entirety, giving us some other examples. For those of you in New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen. Those of you in Connecticut, I used to live in Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal talked about the fact that he didn't even want the Supreme Court chipping away at Roe versus Wade, that this would create and trigger a seismic movement to reform the Supreme Court. And then, lest we forget the one that's probably the most notable for those of you in the state of New York, the Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer actually called out Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh while he was in the front of the Supreme Court saying, I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. And the idea is you better actually vote the way we want you to vote, or there will be consequences. And I think we know what some of those consequences might be. The next page, though, goes on to remind us that what we really always have wanted is a Supreme Court that is outside of politics. That's why the framers gave the justices life tenure. That's why Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 78 talked about judicial independence. And And it used to be that you would never dare criticize the Supreme Court, at least in front of them. Barack Obama did it first, although I'll be fair to say that Jonathan Turley didn't mention that, but he was certainly wise to also mention that President Donald Trump oftentimes attacked the judges as well. And so he, at the end, just says, it is, if you will, sort of interesting that so many of these people are suggesting court packing, judicial stripping, and all sorts of things, when they have also pretty much admitted that the decision, Roe versus Wade, isn't really constitutional. And the example he gives is, of course, Lawrence Tribe. If you're not familiar with Lawrence Tribe, he was a professor at Harvard Law School. Matter of fact, if things had gone differently, so for example, if after Ronald Reagan stepped down, maybe Michael Dukakis had been the president rather than George Herbert Walker Bush, I think Lawrence Tribe would be sitting on the Supreme Court. But anyway, Lawrence Tribe is the one that said one of the most curious things about Roe versus Wade is that behind its own verbal smokescreen, the substantive judgment on which it rests is nowhere to be found. And of course, he reminds us that even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that Roe versus Wade, I believe, would have been more acceptable as a judicial decision if it had not gone beyond the ruling on the extreme statute before the court. A heavy-handed judicial intervention was difficult to justify and appears to provoke, not resolve, the conflict. So whether you look at Lawrence Tribe or the former Justice of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, people who would agree with the decision nevertheless argue that the decision was flawed. And so it's something to pay attention to as we get closer to June and find out how the Supreme will indeed rule in that particular case. But as we are taking a break, let me mention that we do have our Take Action item, and that gives you an opportunity now to contact your two United States senators. As you may know, the Build Back Better Act did pass the House on really a strict party line vote. I think there was only one Democrat that voted against it, so all the Democrats pretty much voted for it, all the Republicans voted against it. But now it's in front of the Senate. And there are, I think, real questions that were raised in the various hearings in the House, even more so as well. So there's a place where we give you some possible comments and give you some of the facts and figures and information at that. You can then type in your zip code, as I'm doing right now, and up comes my two United States senators, and we have a suggested letter, which you can either keep as it is, or you can simply send it out as is. You can edit it, you can change it, you can lengthen it, you can shorten it, whatever you want. And by having the information, if you've done this before, your name already is up there, so all you have to do is hit the button Submit. If this is the very first time you've ever done this, then just put your name and address in there, and then this is clicked out, and it will be sent to your two United States senators. So great opportunity. Wanted to give you that possibility. Those of you that receive an email from me, we sent that out yesterday, but I wanted to wait a little bit and see if some of you want to just respond to that. But if you're listening right now and you want to express your opinion about the Build Back Better Act in front of the Senate, we've made it possible for you at Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Going to spend some time now talking with our good friend Dr. Paul Gould. He's been in studio with us. Matter of fact, last time he was in studio, I think we were talking about the story of the cosmos. We might have been talking about cultural apologetics, but nevertheless, he is an individual that's been in this area of the country. Now he is the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Religion and also the Director of the MA in Philosophy of Religion program at Palm Beach Atlantic University. If that sounds familiar, that's where Dr. Paul Copan is. Recently, I even recommended a student that might want to go there. And, of course, I did mention his book on cultural apologetics, the one on philosophy, A Christian Introduction. Of course, mentioned the story of the cosmos. He's got one coming out, and I would love to get him on to talk about that in the future, which is called A Good and True Story. But we have him on here today to talk about the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. It is something I believe in. As I mentioned just before he joined us, this is not something I'm encouraging you to subscribe to that I don't. I do. I did last year. I noticed I just renewed it in August. I was just looking at my bill to make sure we'd still done all the things that we needed to do. And so, first of all, we're going to talk about this idea of the Worldview Bulletin, which I think would be great for you to have if you're thinking about a Christmas present for somebody that would like to know more about the Christian worldview. I would recommend that as well. And then we'll get into one of the articles on your work in God's calling, because they have been gracious enough to actually post a complimentary article from the October issues so that you can kind of read it and make a decision as to whether or not you might want to subscribe. So, Paul Gould, always great to have you on the program.
Hey, Kerby, it's great to be with you today.
Let's start with the obvious, and that is this is a Worldview Bulletin newsletter, and you have, with your help of other individuals, put together a bulletin, and it's really helpful because, let's face it, I spend a fair amount of time going out on the internet looking for articles we're going to post at Point of View and looking for other things. I even have at Probe Ministries an individual that kind of reads through some of these various magazines and journals and finds things that we might want to know. But let's face it, there's a lot out there that we don't see, and you have provided what I think is an excellent resource for some of our listeners. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I mean, you've actually done a great job describing sort of the heart behind it is kind of twofold. One, we wanted a place to just sort of collate. I mean, you're right, there's so many resources out there on the internet and just in culture at large. And we wanted to have a kind of one-stop place where you can find things that will be helpful as we kind of think through integrating faith with culture, apologetics, philosophy, theology, science, all those things. And so that's part of it. And then the other part was it's an opportunity for us. There's a team of 5 of us actually that write regularly for this to really think through, that kind of intersection of the gospel and apologetics and culture and philosophy and science and things and art and beauty and all of that. And so it's kind of an outlet for us to have a chance to do some of that as well, and kind of a one-stop place for that. So, yeah, that's the little heart behind the bulletin.
First of all, we have a sample of the bulletin, but also if you'd like to know more about Paul, we have paulgould.com, and you don't have to remember how to spell the name or even get the hyphens in the right place or anything else, because it's all on our website at pointofview.net. If you are somewhat interested, it's a place where you can just type in your email, and then you can kind of look a little bit more, but we have posted one of the articles, and this one gets into the issue of vocation. But before you get to the article, you'll see 2 very glowing endorsements, one from Lee Strobel, who's been in studio with us sometimes, and more recently by phone when we talked about his Case for Heaven, in which he called it a must-have resource. And then the other very nice endorsement comes from John Lennox, who's been with us as well, a professor emeritus of mathematics from the University of Oxford, saying that he found it very stimulating. So you can't do much better than that with some of those endorsements. But let's, if we can, Paul, for just a minute, talk about this idea of vocation. There is always been, almost since the time of especially the Enlightenment, but even going further back, to say, well, vocation applies to people in ministry. So those of us in ministry, okay, we're doing the Lord's work. Everybody else, they're just paying for the Lord's work. And I think that is a complete misunderstanding of the idea of work and calling and vocation, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. That sort of more common understanding adopts this thing called the sacred secular split that I would just want to reject. I think you would too, right? This idea that there's this superhero kind of Christian leader that gets paid to do this, and everybody else is kind of, doing something else, worldly pursuits or something like that. But really, I think biblically, the idea is that everything we do matters to God. And of course, if we spend, up to a third of our lives working, of course our work matters to God, and that's part of, our service unto Christ. And so, yeah, this was just a quick little article helping think through that idea of, everything matters, including the most, the main hours of our day. Everything matters under the banner of Christ.
And you give us some numbers that just kind of blew me away. Given the fact that I am still working beyond what some people call retirement age, I guess I can understand that number, but still 90,000 hours of work in a lifetime. And it illustrates again that that's where you spend most of your time and energy and resources. And if you don't see this as a calling, and how many people, Paul, over the years have, in various surveys with Pew Research and Gallup and others, say they hate their work. And yet if we see work as something where we are not just working for our employer, but as it implies, for example, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Colossians and other passages, that we're really working unto the Lord, that should, if nothing else, give us a very different kind of dynamic and appreciation for the work that God has called for us to do.
Yeah, and I love Dorothy Sayers. She wrote this wonderful chapter on work. I think it was in her book Creed and Cosmos, or Christ and Cosmos. But she talked about how you can only define work religiously, and I think she's totally right here. And the reason why she said that is because in asking why work, we're asking this question about value, and that quickly gets into purpose. And even the passage you just referenced in Colossians 3, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, right? That's kind of the model that we see. And so, yeah, I love this. Of course, work would be a religious question, like everything else, because everything is, under the rubric of Christ. So, yeah.
Let's get into another concept, and that is calling. First of all, I love the fact that you do sort of mention and even reference a very good book written years ago by Os Guinness on the calling, called The Call, and a book that, by the way, I would highly recommend. But what about this idea of calling? There we get back to that sacred-secular split. How many times, Paul, you've been in church, I've been in church, especially I've seen this a lot in the Baptist churches where I've been, where, God called me to preach. Well, okay, but I'm not denying that, but I also believe that God may be calling other people to do something which we would consider to be, quote, secular work. What about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I love these, so I had a quote by Guinness and one by Jamie K. Smith and one by Frederick Buechner, and I love that all of them sort of ground this idea of calling or vocation sort of biblically. And in fact, like the Jamie Smith quote there talks about how calling is really rooted in the doctrine of creation, and this fact that creation is not just this statement about what the cosmos is, but it's this manifesto, this calling to be birthed into the world as priests and priestesses or kings and queens that receive everything from God, and then we steward it, and then we re-gift it back to God. And so I really think biblically, calling is just that which God has called us to as image bearers, to reflect his image, and then to sort of unfold the potentialities that he's given us, and to faithfully live, in whatever sphere that God has called us to, whether it's work or ministry, full-time ministry or lawyering or parenting or whatever it is, that all of that matters to God.
So again, this idea of calling, something we should apply. And again, Buechner and Smith and Guinness all get a good mention there. And let me just say that since we're coming to a break, we'll come back and pick out just one more point from the book and the article, because it gets into this whole idea of various helpful ideas in terms of the idea of vocation and calling. So look at all three of those in just a minute. You might get something to write with, and you number 1, 2, 3. But I think this is the way it's put together could be very helpful for those of you that maybe are pastors, and maybe you have a passage that addresses the issue of work, or maybe you want to sometimes take the time to break down that sacred secular split. There are times, I'm sure, when people have been in church, they've heard a sermon, they say it's a wonderful sermon, but I have no idea how to take any of that and apply it to the boardroom or the courtroom or the classroom, wherever I might actually have a calling. And so this would be, I think, very helpful from preaching or teaching, but also, since there's some actual footnotes and other resources, might be something you might want to use sometime in a small group setting to ask some people, what about your work? What about your calling? What about your vocation? And then to use some of the quotes and some of the information in a way that would get them to begin to think biblically, because after all, this is one of those very good articles that appear in the Worldview Bulletin. We'll come back. We'll talk briefly about this idea of how to apply this idea of vocation and this theology of work. And maybe a few comments from Paul Gould about this whole idea of cultural apologetics. His book and Our Need is very great, so we'll talk with him about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Paul Gould with us for a few more minutes, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion, also the Director of the Philosophy Religion Program at Palm Beach Atlantic University, a place that you need to check out because some very gifted individuals actually are working there and teaching there as well, so something to find out about. Paul, for just a minute, let's see if we can talk about some of the ideas that you think would be helpful in developing a theology of work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one interesting question when you talk about a theology of work is, we see in Scripture this general call that we've already kind of talked about where, for example, like in Ephesians 4:1, where Paul calls all people to live, a life worthy of his calling. But then we also have this intuition that, God has called me for a specific work, and I think we like that intuition. C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, they all thought about it this way. And I think we even have hints in Scripture. So, for example, I'm thinking of Ephesians 2:10, where it talks about how, we're created by God as these, literal works of art created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So I kind of like to think about it as, that God has created each of us for good works. And so part of our job as we discern God's call and the work that God has called us to is to listen and to really listen to this nexus of what are the deep passions of the heart and how do they interact with the deep hungers of the world. And somewhere within that, I think we might, be able to discern what is that thing that God has called us to do. We think about calling.
And you certainly see that in the Buechner quotes you have here. The kind of work that God calls you to is that which is most needed to be done and what the world needs to be done. So that is certainly the case. And you do talk about the idea of having a robust theology of vocation, really trying to discern God's call and even cultivate the spiritual discipline of listening. And then finally, of course, something that I think most of our listeners would understand, everything matters. All is from God. Nothing that exists is apart from God's loving care. So this is just a very good piece to help people think about calling and work. But before we let you go, I did want to come back to, of course, the fact that we've had you on this program to talk about cultural apologetics. Matter of fact, I looked it up. We had you in studio, I think, last time, which was March 28th, 2019. So anyway, somebody can type in on the Point of View website, cultural apologetics, and they can also find the book, which is out. But I wanted to have you maybe speak to that for just a minute, and I will confess that the biggest problem sometimes when we do apologetics here on Point of View is it tends to be fairly left brain, very linear, logical. And when you have a Lee Strobel on here, J. Warner Wallace, or whatever, lots of times it's full of evidence and logic and the rest. But one of the things I've appreciated about your book and your writings is that there's another aspect to apologetics, and that is right hemisphere, cultural philosophy, aesthetics, art, music, culture. And I think we miss sometimes the opportunity to see that also is a very profound argument for the gospel and for a belief in God, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I love, I guess, I always go back to this idea from C.S. Lewis where he said, basically this idea that Christianity is this perfect blend of reason and what he would call romance, this longing for home, this longing to experience beauty and goodness as well. And so the reason why I'm super excited about this book, Cultural Apologetics, is because it really kind of pushes, I think, the way we think about apologetics. We tend to think about apologetics as showing the reasonableness of Christianity. And of course, we ought to do that always. Any cultural apologetic worth its salt ought to be able to show the reasonableness of Christianity. But the reality is there's all these other objections to the faith as well, and they have to do with the goodness and the beauty or the desirability of Christianity. And so cultural apologetics is basically working to show both that Christianity is true to the way the world is, that's the reasonableness part, but it's also true to the way the world ought to be, and that's the desirability part, that it satisfies all the deep longings of the human heart. And of course, that's if God is the creator of all things, we would want to employ all the sort of resources at our disposal. So, of course, yes, walk that plank of reason, but there's so many other things I think that point to and are evocative of the gospel and Jesus. And so that's what I'm trying to do in that book, in that project.
Let me mention that the book came out in March of 2019, so it's been out for a little while, and certainly you can find it still in your bookstore. We still have a link to it. You can find it there. It's in paperback or Kindle. And I just think it really answers one of those questions, because, Paul, what I'm running into is sometimes we're finding with the younger generation, and I've been doing lots of various interviews apart from this program on a survey that we did at Probe Ministries on Generation Y and Generation Z. And some of the questions that millennials and the iGen generation are asking are not, is Christianity true, but is Christianity good? Or even a more significant one, which gets back to your colleague Paul Copan, is God even good? I mean, how is it that we seem to have a genocidal God? And so there is a sense in which, sure, at one point, the logic and linear conversations are important, giving facts and evidence. But I think a lot of that is emotive, and it's more in the aesthetic realm. And that's why I'm so excited about your book, Cultural Apologetics. And I wanted, just before we let you go, to mention it and encourage people to get a copy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I'm excited in a year, this a sequel will actually come out, A Good and True Story, which is actually not a book about cultural apologetics. It's actually a work of cultural apologetics. So it's written for non-believers, and it's trying to do exactly that, take the reader on a journey, but to blend reason and romance to point to the beauty and the goodness and truth of Christianity. So, yeah, super excited for that to come out in November of next year.
Well, we have to wait a year, and we'll wait, but certainly love to get you on the program to talk about that. One last time, again, we've been talking about the Worldview Bulletin newsletter, and if you would like to know more about that, we have that information at our website. And so, first of all, you can click on the picture of Paul Gould, and you can see some of the things that he has been writing about, some of his favorite books and the rest. And then you can, of course, also see that we have some other great resources that you might appreciate, all available at our website at pointofview.net. And Paul Gould, thank you for being with us, and look forward to hearing more about your upcoming book, and let's get you on the program when that does come out.
Very good. Thanks so much, Kerby. Have a great rest of your day.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Michael Andrews for a little while about the influential Christian learning to lead from the heart. But this is a perfect time as we go to a break for you to, first of all, you can find my Viewpoints commentary on the issue of abortion and whether or not the decision that might come down from the Supreme Court to agree with the Mississippi law, whether that would then actually put us in a different circumstance. Actually, it would keep us more in line with some of the laws that you have in Europe, and I think that's a surprise to most people. But as you go there, that middle column is a take action item. And if you have not expressed your opinion about the Build Back Better bill or act, it is now in front of the United States Senate. And if you have already contacted your senators, great. But I suspect many of us would certainly like to make it a little easier. So all you have to do is click on the button there that says Take Action, put in your zip code, and immediately what it does is it pops up your two United States senators, gives you a sample letter, lets you edit it. And if you've already done this before, then you just hit the button that says Submit. If this is the first time, well, then you have to put your name and address there so they know who you are. And we've made it very easy. So if you have been concerned, as we are, about this particular piece of legislation, not just the cost, which is ridiculous, but also just many of the toxic ideas in it, I think it is time to express your opinion. We'll be talking about that tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because he's written some very good pieces, opinion pieces about it as well, and discovered some other problems with it, as if we haven't found enough. But given the length of the bill, I guess it's not surprising that some of us have not actually seen all of it, and the more we know, the worse it is. So again, we've made it easy for you to respond, so take the time to do so. We'll take a break and talk about the influential Christian with Mike Adams right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about leadership, which is a topic we address many times here on Point of View. We're going to talk about learning to lead from the heart, and what about empathy and how to maybe be a more gracious but certainly more significant and effective leader. So I think you're going to appreciate that. We'll spend some time talking today with Dr. Michael Andrews, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. Our good friend Dr. Jim Dennison has talked about some of the articles being used and some of the arguments being deployed, even in the Supreme Court decision on this issue of abortion. I want to take those on for just a few minutes. Also, we have a new CEO of Twitter. What is that going to mean in terms of free speech? Probably it's not good. So we'll get into some of that, and we might talk a little bit more about a couple of other topics in the news. And if we can't get to all of those, of course, we'll cover those tomorrow in our Friday weekend edition. The author of this book, The Influential Christian, is Dr. Michael Andrews, individual that has retired as an engineer from the telecommunications industry, but also has a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Ministry as well, and is an ordained minister, and joins us now by phone. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
This book, about 220 pages, lots of great scripture, 7 chapters. I wanted to try to give people an understanding of some of the material in it, and then encourage people, if they would like to find the book, they might be able to find it in the local bookstore. But as always, we have a link so they can get it in a paperback or Kindle. But right off the bat, we need to maybe clarify a few definitions. And one is the difference between empathy, which is a key word running all the way through your book, and sympathy. Can you help us out with that?
Well, empathy is a newer word than sympathy, and when it was coined in the early 1900s, it took away some of the definitions that sympathy had been taking on. And nowadays, when people talk about empathy, they often refer to it as having more of an emotional content, relating to another person emotionally, and sympathy, they have more of a cognitive or rational thinking kind of a component. I prefer to think of empathy as encompassing all of those things, because it avoids the confusion. If we just think about relating to other people and valuing them and their experience, both in their thinking, and in their feeling and in the way they relate to people, I think we have a more holistic view of it. So that's kind of how I view empathy, more in a larger picture kind of perspective.
Now, you actually talk about different attributes of empathy in terms of contextual, humble, rooted in narrative, communal, purpose-centered, action-oriented, risky. In some respects, there's a good illustration. As a matter of fact, there are lots of good illustrations of that in the scriptures, aren't they? So help us understand a little bit more of this idea, because if we're going to be leaders, and let's face it, everybody's a leader in some case. There are people that follow you. There are parents that are leaders. There are people that are listening right now that are leaders in their church, leaders in their community, in their business. If we want to develop this and become, as the book says, an influential Christian, we really need to understand what it is and then how to begin to develop it in our own lives.
Right. Empathy is like a virtue. It's sort of like if you wanted to develop courage or wisdom or whatever, it's hard to just attack it head on and say, oh, I'm going to now be empathetic. The way empathy works is that we become more empathetic by doing empathetic things. Just like if you want to become more courageous, you would figure out what kinds of things you could do that exhibited courage, and by exhibiting those, you then become more courageous. Empathy is like that. We do some things that put us in a position for God to work with us and on us by His Spirit to make us relate to people in a better way. And those different attributes are ways of understanding how we can approach other people and approach God so that we learn more about empathy. It is contextual. It depends on the circumstances. Empathy is all about understanding the circumstances and situation that another person is in and how they view that situation. It's not just us walking in their shoes, but it's more than that. It's us understanding what it means for that other person to walk in their shoes, and that requires a fair amount of humility. And we see Jesus doing that in the New Testament.
We certainly do, because go into outside of the Jewish territory and interacting with an individual that's a Canaanite and all sorts of things. So that's interesting, because no Jew would actually interact with a Samaritan or a Canaanite. That's exactly what Jesus does. So he actually provides a model for it, doesn't he?
Yes, he is the best model of empathy we have. He is the best model of God's empathy, because God showed his empathy by the incarnation, by coming to us in the flesh, in Jesus. That's how he shows his empathy. And so if we want to figure out how to be empathetic, modeling after Jesus is really the way to do it. And we see him taking risks, like you say. He was doing things, interacting with people that none of the upright folks would have condoned. And so if we're following him in that way, we'll do some similar things, and it may not always be accepted to the people around us. It may not always be logical to the people around us, but the focus is on the other person, not on ourselves.
One of the other things you talk about is empathy is rooted in narrative, and not only did Jesus demonstrate it with his behavior, but with his parables. You have, of course, the Good Samaritan. You have, of course, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, the prodigal son, and other examples in which Jesus also uses these stories and these parables to teach empathy as well, didn't he?
Yes, and that is an extremely important part of developing empathy, is having a foundation, a basis upon which we show it. I don't think anyone innately shows altruistic tendencies toward other people without something that guides them. And the Christian story, following Christ, is I think the ultimate best example. We find other people, though, who are not Christians, who exhibit empathetic behaviors, and I believe in every case there's been something in their background story, something in their overarching narrative that gives them a reason for doing that very thing. This book is based on the Christian narrative, because I think that is the best foundation for relating to other people and showing empathy.
Might just mention as we go to a break that one of the really enjoyable diagrams here is where you are explaining identification, manipulation, projection, and isolation, and you use Charlie Brown. So not only do you use scripture, but of course Charlie Brown is in one of those particular sections, Lucy is in another, Schroeder's in another one, Peppermint Patty's another one, and Linus is right in the middle. And so again, that's kind of hard to explain on radio, but it's a really good diagram, and it might bring a smile to your face. But we'll come back and talk about, well, what does this mean exactly? Because we're talking about this book, The Influential Christian. We recognize the need for empathy, and that is a Christian leader, I think, should be different than somebody who is simply providing leadership in the world. But what does that mean, and how does it play out? So we'll talk a little bit more about this book, and if it is something that would be of interest to you, you can click on the button that says See More, and you will see that we have an opportunity for you to get the book in paperback or Kindle. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we certainly have made it easy for you to find there. And it came out in about a month ago, so it's just out, and it's something we thought you'd like to know about, because leadership is a key point, and how do we lead from a Christian point of view? This is a book that will be helpful in that regard. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Abortion is in the news because of the Mississippi law being considered by the Supreme Court. It limits elective abortion to 15 weeks. Although critics portray it as extreme, it really isn't much different from what we are seeing in current laws in Europe. Angelina Guyon explains that America is the outlier. She does a comparative analysis between the Mississippi law and the European abortion laws, which also limit abortion to less than 15 weeks gestation. Here's some of the numbers. Of the 50 European countries analyzed in the report, 8 do not allow elective abortion at all. They either prohibit abortion altogether or else allow abortion for only specific reasons, such as socioeconomic grounds, fetal abnormalities, rape, or incest. Of the 42 remaining European countries, 39 of them limit abortion to 15 weeks gestation or earlier. A majority of those 39 countries set gestational limits for elective abortion at or before 12 weeks gestation. Americans often want to follow the pattern in the UK, but they would be surprised to learn that the country restricts abortion more than the U.S. Great Britain still requires a woman to provide some justification to legally obtain an abortion. She predicts there would be a national uproar if elective abortion was limited merely to the first trimester, yet the Mississippi law is less restrictive than the abortion policies in 47 of the European countries. The law is mainstream and perhaps even permissive based upon European standards. Currently, a woman can obtain an abortion in the U.S. without having to provide a reason, need, or justification. The Supreme Court has allowed some states to limit abortion in the third trimester and for a small number of other reasons. But when compared to Europe, America is the outlier. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Michael Andrews with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, The Influential Christian, Learning to Lead from the Heart. We have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. And again, you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And it is full of great material and lots of diagrams, and then a whole section after each chapter of questions for group discussion. So if you'd like to teach on leadership, I've done that in my own church. Perhaps you are doing that right now and want to teach about how to lead from a Christian point of view. Here's a book that we would certainly want to put in your hands. Michael, if nothing else, there are some chapters that you have about empathic reception, reflection, and response. And so some people might be saying, okay, I get the idea that I should have empathy, and I understand that the Bible certainly speaks to that. Jesus models it. He teaches about that. But can you help us now, maybe with chapters 4, 5, and 6, talking about what that might look like in terms of empathic reception, for example?
Yes. I think one of the key things to understand, first of all, is that empathy is not really an innate trait that some people have and some people don't. We can all develop skills that lead to more empathetic behaviors. And so I lay out 3 general areas that are a progression from being receptive, the kinds of things that open us up to listening and dialoguing with other people so that we know what situation they're in, how they're experiencing their situation, and that creates in us a more open perspective so that we understand the other person better that we are talking to. And once we've established that kind of dialogue, particularly with people who are different than us, it's good to then reflect on what we're hearing each other say. Most of our behavior stems from assumptions that we make about how we see the world. And so the step of reflection is looking at those assumptions together and figuring out what's significant there. And sometimes when we're talking to people, even though we disagree, we find some big areas of commonality of things that we want together. And our assumptions of how to get there are what's different. And we can have a discussion around how those assumptions differ and how we see meaning being formed in the events and situations that we're going through. And once we've explored what meaning looks like together with the other person, then we can start to look at how what kinds of actions are appropriate for us to take. Obviously, the best kinds of actions would be actions that we would take together with the other person toward their situation, towards something they're concerned about, something we're concerned about. Taking action together does not mean necessarily that we compromise or that we change our perspectives, although I will say that anytime that we are engaging in empathetic behaviors with people, our own perspective will undoubtedly become enriched. We'll understand the other person, and therefore we'll understand our own assumptions and what's significant to us better. And then we can figure out how to respond in a way that takes responsibility and shows responsibility to the other person, not just emphasizing our own story, but representing them in the larger perspective that we're attempting to work on together.
And again, so it moves from kind of open thinking you talk about to receptive engagement to even what you call apprenticeships. When you talk about reflection, that's kind of perceptive thinking, reflective engagement, and friendships. So how does that work its way out?
Well, it's all about our relationships with the other person. And if we approach another person seeking to learn, not necessarily, and again, I emphasize, I'm not talking here about willy-nilly throwing up our own perspectives and positions or anything like that. What I'm talking about is exploring with the other person how they see the world and going to other people and seeking to learn from them. I've not met too many people that when approached by someone seeking to learn from them that they would clam up. Most people want to talk about themselves and tell their own story. And so we can approach people as apprentices to other people, and that will help us both open up more. And then as time goes on, we can actually pursue developing a friendship. Now, that's not going to work in every case, but we'll become more like friends to each other as we work together and sharpen each other's perspectives and assumptions. And then we can move on even beyond that, beyond the perceptive thinking, to even thinking about what society is like between the two of us and among a group or whatever. And we can start to develop what actually leads to kinships,
Right.
a brotherhood, a social community that actually respects and helps each other.
You know, I was just thinking, in some respects, you were just talking about friendships a minute ago. We've been even more recently talking with David French about the fact that we've seen situations in the past where people who disagree politically with each other pretty strongly still are very good friends. And you can have friendships in which we can agree to disagree. But back to your point, that once you get to the response, which is the other chapter in your book, that leads to responsive engagement and even kinships. And at a time when we have so much polarization, it is hard to see people actually working together. It's hard to find examples of civility. So even though in some respects your book is all about leadership, it is also really about what this particular very divided country needs right now, the willingness to listen to others. And by listening to others doesn't mean I agree with you, but a willingness to at least give another person's perspective a chance to be expressed. And especially on the left, but sometimes even on the right, that is shut down with censorship. And so I think your book really provides a great opportunity. But before we run out of time, Michael, talk about how we can use the book, because I know we have listeners right now that are actually leading a Bible study or a Bible fellowship, maybe a small group. At the end of every one of your chapters, you have at least a dozen questions for group description. So you have really created a book that's almost plug and play. If somebody wanted to start talking about leadership and applying biblical principles to leadership, the book really stands alone. You almost don't need a leader's guide, because everything you need's right there in the book, isn't it?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's what I was aiming for. I am a teacher in a church context myself, and as someone who organizes teachers in that context, I have been looking for some time for ways to help people develop as leaders, as teachers, and so I think this book, with what has in each chapter, plus those discussion questions, which I think are thoughtful discussion questions, not the prying kind, where you ask, have you stopped beating your spouse yet? That kind of, question that nobody wants to answer. I think these are the kinds of questions that people can answer and engage in a group discussion, which is the kind of teaching environment that I really like. And in addition, there are some personal examples. I live in the Greenville, South Carolina area, and in our area, like many other parts of the country, there are people who are really great examples of empathetic behavior. And so I give some examples, an example between each chapter to emphasize what that chapter has been talking about. And those examples, I think, can spur some really great discussion in a group setting as well.
So again, there's a whole bibliography. The notes go on for about 12 pages. There's a scripture index and all the rest. So if you find yourself wanting to teach about leadership, if you certainly want to just encourage the body of Christ to interact in a more positive way with one another, I think you're going to find the book very helpful. So Michael Andrews, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Again, one last time, the book is entitled The Influential Christian Leading to Lead from the Heart. It's been great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of other issues in the news. One of those is that our good friend Jim Dennison has put together, I think, about a half a dozen good responses to some of the arguments that might now surface because of the Supreme Court decision. So we'll talk about that for just a minute, get into some other issues in the news. But don't forget, we're encouraging you today to go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says Take Action, and you have an opportunity to contact your 2 United States senators, and so let me encourage you to do that. And as you do, I think you will have actually fulfilled your civic responsibility. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, well, we will be talking about that tomorrow with Dr. Merrill Matthews. He's written quite a number of articles related to some of the things that now people have been able to ferret out from the bill. These bills are so long, sometimes it takes days for people to even know what's in them. Of course, you heard Nancy Pelosi years ago say, well, we have to pass it to find out what's in it. That doesn't make me feel good. When they're actually ratifying pieces of legislation that they haven't read any more than you've read in the various contracts you get with your iPhone, I don't feel comfortable about the future of this country. So we will spend some time talking about this tomorrow, of course, with Dr. Merrill Matthews and Lathan Watts. But when we come back, you might want to get a piece of paper, number 1 to 6. How do we respond to the 6 most prevalent secular arguments for abortion? We'll try to give you that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we've been talking about the need for you to contact your two senators about the Build Back Better Act in front of Senate. And, of course, we will get into some other issues as well. Let me just mention that my commentary today is called America the Outlier, and it is really based on a very good piece that came out in which there was a survey, actually, of all these different European countries. countries. And what it was so interesting is that if you compare the Mississippi bill, which is called the Mississippi Gestational Age Act, which passed really by a bipartisan vote a number of years ago, it would limit elective abortion to 15 weeks. And it defines the term, but then it goes on in this piece to actually then compare this to what you find in various European countries. And of the 50 European countries, first of all, 8 do not really allow elective abortion at all, or with such limitations as to pretty much prevent that. But then of the other 42, 39 of them limit elective abortions to 15 weeks of gestation or earlier. So the point I make is that everybody want you to think that America is actually right in step with all of the European countries. And the reality is, no, right now America is the outlier and very different. And that came up in the oral arguments yesterday, in which the Chief Justice said, we've got an abortion policy here in this country that's more like what you have in China and North Korea. Not exactly the company you want to keep. So anyway, that piece is there for you to read. And as you read it, maybe you want to print it out or something, and that will help you maybe to make a case. But I thought for just a minute, our good friend Jim Dennison will be on the studio with us in the future, has, of course, the daily article. But what he's done is taken some time to respond to some of the, if you will, secular arguments for why we should not change Roe versus Wade. Of course, he's talked about the biblical arguments, and I mentioned earlier that we, of course, have our little booklet on abortion, which I'm holding up right now for you to see. And the first section, of course, talks about biblical arguments against abortion. Then it gives you medical arguments against abortion, then legal arguments against abortion, and then philosophical arguments against abortion. This is a little different, so you might number 1 to 6, and I just wanted to give you maybe a tool for your pro-life toolbox in case you find yourself arguing or interacting with somebody on whether or not Roe versus Wade should be overturned by the Supreme Court. The first one involves the Latin term I just mentioned, stare decisis. That's S-T-A-R-E, decisis, D-E-C-I-S-I-S. The stare decisis argument. Stare decisis in the Latin, basically to stand by things decided. In other words, we've got this as a precedent. We certainly can't change it. And that was an argument. Matter of fact, the primary argument, if I could say, of the 3 liberal justices yesterday, in which the idea is that Roe versus Wade is settled law. It was revisited in 1992, Casey versus Planned Parenthood. So it's settled law. And so that's why, indeed, we certainly cannot overturn it. Well, the quick response from Jim Dennison, and the one I would make as well, is the Supreme Court has overturned other previous decisions. I mentioned 2 of those last hour, but let me mention them again. One would be the Dred Scott decision, which allowed for slavery, gave, if you will, the first kind of institutional support for slavery, because it had really been kind of an outlier in the way the Constitution was written. And another would be Plessy versus Ferguson, and you can come up with others. But this particular piece says that there have been 230 times in which the Supreme Court has changed a previous decision. And some of those are not as major as Plessy or Dred Scott, but there are very significant times in which stare decisis is not a very compelling argument. The second one is the viability argument, the argument that the unborn child should be protected by law once it could survive outside the womb, but it could be aborted prior to that, because the argument was actually something that eventually was sort of implied in Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton. It was even more codified in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But as he points out, the standard, if applied to small children or a variety of others, seniors, the infirmed, or people with severe diseases. I mean, you would see that work doesn't very well, because how viable is somebody that's on life support? And that's the problem. Every argument for abortion ultimately could also be used as an argument for infanticide, killing babies, or even euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, killing the elderly and infirmed. So that's the viability argument, number 2. Number 3 is the imposing morality argument, and we've heard this before. That is, the state cannot legislate morality. I hope you've listened to Point of View enough to know that every law is, in a sense, a legislation of morality. Certainly laws against crime of any sort, whether that is theft, burglary, rape, whether it's murder, property damage of any sort. I mean, we recognize that, of course, that is the case. And so that is certainly an argument that I think we could pretty quickly dismiss. But again, it's one that you hear. Number 4, the argument, the no unwanted child argument. Because a woman should not be forced to bear a child that she does not want to keep. And that, again, I think was very ably answered by Justice Amy Coney Barrett in terms of just her lifestyle, an individual that has born children and adopted children. And we've talked on this program about the real emphasis in some of the schools, churches, and especially pregnancy resource centers to really beef up and encourage adoption as an alternative to abortion. Which brings us back to the last 2, and I will admit that the last 2 sometimes get written into law. I would be hopefully a consistent pro-life person, but I recognize that some people, number 5, would talk about the rape and incest argument. Now, the reality is that almost all these laws allow for an exception for rape or incest. But again, as Jim Dennison points out, we're talking about maybe 1% through rape, maybe a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of percent for incest. But again, you can honestly just come back and recognize that if you want to be consistently pro-life, even when a crime was committed that brought a child into the womb and into the world, that child should not be killed. And I have on this program and in this studio and in all the other studios over these last a couple of decades had a chance over the years to interview people sitting across from me who were products of rape or products of incest. And it's just hard to look them in the eye and say, your mother should have aborted you simply because you were a product of rape. It's just hard for me to say that. And I recognize that in the real world, some of those ideas probably are going to be implemented, but that is the case. And that leads to the 6th and final argument, the health of the mother argument. And as we've talked about before with Dr. Wilkie and other obstetricians and others, because of the incredible advances in neonatology, this is becoming even less and less of a possible concern in terms of physical issues. Sometimes mental is used. But again, these are just a few of the arguments. You can, of course, go to Jim Dennison's daily article. And number 1, again, is the stare decisis argument. Number 2 is the viability argument. Number 3 is the imposing morality argument. Number 4 is the no unwanted child argument. Number 5 is the rape and incest argument. And number 6 is the health of the mother argument. And again, we recognize that sometimes these are difficult decisions, especially when we get to number 5 and number 6. But if there's anything we learn from ethics, very difficult decisions do not create the rule. The argument always was, well, what about these very difficult decisions? Well, even though I would not agree with various carve-outs that are created in the law for rapes, incest, or health of the mother, and I certainly would not want to try to implement that from a state, you recognize that sometimes doctors do the best they can with the evidence that they have at the moment. And that's another reason why trying to mandate some of this from either the federal government the Supreme Court, or even eventually perhaps from state legislatures, is, of course, extremely dangerous. We would hope that most doctors go into the profession because they want to save life, and so they would do what they can to save the life of the baby, the life of the mother, to alleviate the pain or concerns or emotional trauma of a mother because of rape or incest. But those are the arguments. Wanted to at least give you a couple of talking points and some thoughts of some very important tools you can put in your pro-life toolbox. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow is our weekend edition, and it'll be an opportunity to hear from Lathan Watts and Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll get into some of the issues related to, of course, the Build Back Better law and what is actually being considered right now in the United States Senate. Lathan Watts has written about the issue of religious liberty and a variety of other topics that we will address, including the economy and much more. So hope you'll join us then. And, of course, we will open up the phones early so you can comment about some of the topics we will address. Just before we run out of time, a couple of real quick points. First of all, I've posted a piece by Ann Coulter, and if you want to read it in its entirety, I won't go through all of it. She's having a little bit of fun. She does use an amount of sarcasm and satire, so you have to understand that sometimes she's really having some fun at the expense of individuals, but she's pointing out something I am concerned about, and that is the new CEO of Twitter, Parag Agrawal, all, is probably an individual that is even less patient for things that he or various liberals at this Silicon Valley organization would put up with. And so she starts out by talking about the fact, man, he's going to really help us with misinformation, and then quotes a number of things which come from CNN and others, arguing that conservatives sometimes tend to believe false news or misinformation. And so she's pointed out that maybe he will be providing a great service, since individuals that were Trump supporters, individuals that are Republicans, individuals who maybe are conservative, may be more susceptible to misinformation. So maybe she will and he will be doing a very good public service. But then she very quickly then says, well, what about this idea of Jussie Smollett? Because after all, there's a good example of something where we really thought that from almost the beginning, this was probably a fake hate crime. Since the court case is continuing, we won't get into all the issues, although now you have some of the, quote, attackers admitting that they even had a trial run. I think they've even got it on video. So then she reminds us that if you're really wanting to argue that people are subject to misinformation, Twitter had no problem publishing, and here's just a short list. Here's what Joe Biden said. What happened to Jussie Smollett may never be tolerated in this country. We must stand up and demand that we no longer give this hate safe harbor. The homophobia and racism have no place in our streets and our hearts. We're with you, Jussie. Of course, then Senator Kamala Harris. Jussie Smollett is one of the kindest, most gentle human beings I know. This was an attempted modern-day lynching. No, it wasn't. It was a complete hoax. Nancy Pelosi, representative, of course, Speaker of the House. The racist, homophobic attack is an affront to our humanity. No one should be attacked for who they are and whom they love. Then you have Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator. This is a sickening and outrageous attack, and horribly, it's the latest of too many hate crimes against LGBTQ people and people of color. We're all responsible for condemning this behavior. Goes on and on and on. And then, of course, you got to at least put in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There is no such thing as racially charged. This attack was not possibly homophobic. It was racist and homophobic attack. It's what you don't like and it's happening in this country. It's no one's job to water down or sugarcoat the rise of hate crimes. Of course, a lot of this coming out at a time when people are saying, it doesn't really make any sense, at a time when the temperature was below zero, to think that these are individuals walking around with MAGA hats, putting a noose around an individual when there's kind of a polar vortex and all of the rest. Really? In a country, or actually you should say a city, which all of Chicago, the numbers she even puts in there, of 12% of the entire city of Chicago voted for Donald Trump in 2016. There were just so many things that didn't ring true, but by goodness, if you even suggested that was maybe a fake hate crime or a hoax or a fraud, oh my goodness, the world would come crashing down on your heads. And of course, Twitter did nothing to try to deal with some of that misinformation for quite some time. And isn't it interesting, as I pointed out yesterday, that it took 3 years for us to actually have a trial about an individual who was obviously perpetuating a very elaborate hoax. But nevertheless, if you'd like to read a little bit more, it's a reminder that when it comes down to misinformation, anything that Twitter doesn't like, especially if it looks conservative, that's misinformation. Anything that is presented by any progressive, well, not so much. Real quickly, I may post this tomorrow in case you'd like to read it, a very good piece that came out by Jerry Newcomb, because some of you have been asking, well, what about this Salvation Army guide that actually was trying to have a conversation about racism? First of all, aren't we already having a conversation about racism? I think so. And, of course, it has a whole section there about white Americans that should stop trying to be colorblind. And, of course, Jerry Newcomb says, stop trying to be colorblind. I thought that was the ideal promoted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to actually deal with people according to the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Well, nevertheless, Salvation Army has pulled the document down, possibly because of the blowback. The organization issued this statement: the International Social Justice Commission, which is part of the Salvation Army. I didn't even know the Salvation Army had an International Social Justice Commission. That might tell you something right there. Has withdrawn the guide for appropriate review. Okay. Well, Jerry Newcomb, I think, wisely says, look, racism is a horrific evil, but some critics are concerned that rather than responding to actual racism, Salvation Army has aligned itself with various people that are kind of ideologically with those who are talking about systemic racism, anti-racism, white privilege, white supremacy, and the rest. And so this is why there has been some real concern. And this couldn't be at a worse time when many of us walk past those red kettles and wonder, should we give to it? Should we not? And I suspect it's going to affect them in some very significant ways. And then Jerry does take the time to remind us of the history of the Salvation Army, which is really quite amazing, because back in 1865, this is where they were working tirelessly in the slums of London and work in 131 nations around the globe. But he says anyone who promotes the disintegration of the family, like BLM and others, promotes poverty and further leads to the disintegration of society. And he points out something we've talked about on this program before. The Brookings Institute says that you have a 98% chance of avoiding poverty if you do three things. Number one, graduate from high school. Number two, work full time. Number three, marry before you have children. Only 2% of those who do these things end up in poverty. And I've pointed out, if you look on the other side, if you not do one of those, you actually vastly increase the possibility of being in poverty. So we'll be paying attention to this, and they have withdrawn the document. Let's give them credit where credit is due. But just the other day, Kelly Shackelford, who's written about this, and others have simply said it would be better if they'd apologize instead of just simply taking it down. And tomorrow we'll probably talk a little bit about the whole supply chain shortage, but President Biden, as I mentioned earlier, has a great solution for that, and that is, don't worry, because after all, we've had shortages before. If you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, can't you remember when Cabbage Patch Kids and Beanie Babies were hard to find? And I just think it's kind of interesting that that was the best argument we got about the supply chain shortage, but we're going to have a lot more to say about that tomorrow, so you can join us then. Lathan Watts, Dr. Merrill Matthews. As we leave, don't forget you can go to the website, click on that button that says Take Action. The Build Back Better Act is in front of the United States Senate, and I think your two United States senators need to hear from you, so express your opinion to them. I want to thank Andrew, glad he is back as our engineer, Steve as our producer, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.